خان جوان قومون يا يمن جلت يا أنا مخمضون دم خيمو لا شيء خالي باختنا خم يزمورون يا يمن ورد الكالو ربيمون دم خيمون لا شيء خالي. And I'll just say in Aramaic, for the benefit of Dr. Jeloo, welcome. We are delighted to have you here with us, and we are all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fassberg. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and I would like to thank especially the Ben Tzvi Institute for organizing today's Zoom conference, and especially Dr. Yaakov Maoz. Shlam alochon, shalom aleichem. Hello, everybody. I wish I could speak in Hebrew. I can speak in Aramaic, but most of you probably won't understand. So I'm going to start a little bit in general to talk about Aramaic and its origins. I know you wanted to talk about that, Professor Fassberg, but after that, I'm going to go into a little bit about the Aramaic-speaking Jews of the region of Assyria. So let me just share my screen. Okay. All right. So firstly, let me see. How come this isn't moving? There you go. So Aramaic belongs to the northwest group of the Semitic language family, which includes Canaanite languages such as Phoenician and Hebrew. So hence Aramaic and Hebrew are sister languages. So just remember that. Aramaic languages are written in the Aramaic alphabet, which was derived from the Phoenician one. Now, as a vehicle for easy and convenient written communication, this was superior to the complex cuneiform writing system, which had been created and developed in Mesopotamia. In time, the Assyrians developed a more refined Aramaic alphabet in a distinctive square style better suited to the language. The ancient Israelites adopted this for writing their own language. Ketav Ashuri, or simply Ashurit, is thus the term used in the Babylonian Talmud to refer to what is known today as the Hebrew alphabet. According to the Talmud, the Torah was given by Moses in the Assyrian alphabet, later changed to the Old Hebrew alphabet known as Liboni, meaning Lebanese or Phoenician, and again, the Assyrian script during the time of the prophet Ezra, who was the first to mandate that the Torah and other Jewish ceremonial items be written in the Assyrian rather than the Old Hebrew script. The other main writing system used for Aramaic, until modern times is the Cursive Syriac alphabet developed by Christian Assyrians. So during its 3,000-year-long history, Aramaic went through several stages of development. Serving as a language of public life and administration for ancient kingdoms and empires, as well as divine worship and religious study. It subsequently branched into several languages that are still spoken today. Now, originally, Aramaic was the language of the Arameans, who were first mentioned at the end of the 12th century BC and inhabited the northern Levant and parts of Mesopotamia. By around 1000 BC, they ruled a string of kingdoms between Damascus and Aleppo, and these dominated the history of that region for about 3 centuries, though in conflict with or as vassals of Assyrian rulers. Now, inscriptions from those city-states thus make Aramaic one of the world's oldest recorded living languages. Now, due to the increased Aramean migration eastward, the western periphery of Assyria became bilingual in both Akkadian, the original Assyrian language, and Aramaic as early as the mid-9th century BC. As the Neo-Assyrian Empire conquered Aramean lands west of the Euphrates, Tiglath-Pileser III adopted Aramaic as its second official language. it eventually supplanted Akkadian completely. Already by this time, a uniform written form of Aramaic had been developed in Assyria, and with its rise to prominence as a lingua franca under the Assyrians, led it to become a prestige language. From 700 BC, its use as a major means of communication in diplomacy and trade spread throughout Assyria, Babylonia, the Levant, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. So here you can see a comparison between the extent of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the extent of Aramaic. Now, already at the close of the First Temple period, we observe that only the upper strata of Judeans spoke Aramaic. In 2 Kings, we read that the 7th century BC Assyrian king Sennacherib sent some officers to threaten Judah. When they reached the gates of Jerusalem and called for King Hezekiah, he sent out representatives to speak on his behalf. The Assyrian field commander, however, wasn't interested in having a private discussion with them. Instead, he made threats loudly enough in Hebrew for the Jewish citizens on the wall to hear. Then, the text says, Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah said to the field commander, "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it, and don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people that are on the wall." They didn't want the Jews listening to understand what the commander was saying, so they asked him to speak in Aramaic. Thus, only the most well-educated Israelites actually spoke it. Now, the scribes of the Neo-Assyrian bureaucracy thus used Aramaic, and this practice was subsequently inherited by the succeeding Neo-Babylonian Empire and later by the Persian Achaemenid Empire following their conquest of Mesopotamia. Since it had been in use, it was adopted by the conquerors as the vehicle for written communication between the various regions of their vast empire with its different peoples and languages. And this marks the central phase in the development of Old Aramaic. Mediated by scribes that had been trained in the language, Imperial Aramaic, a highly standardized written form of the language, progressively became the lingua franca of public life, trade, and commerce throughout Achaemenid territories as far as Central Asia. Now, many of the extant documents witnessing this form of Aramaic come from Egypt, particularly the 5th century Jewish military colony of Elephantine, which was established as an Achaemenid outpost. Of them, the best known is the story of Ahikar, who was a sage at the Assyrian court. In addition, the Aramaic portion of the Book of Daniel, which in its preserved form dates from the 2nd century BC, is another example of Imperial Aramaic. Moreover, the Aramaic texts in the Book of Ezra reproduce quite literally the exchange of official documents concerning the necessary permits from the central government required for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and the return of Jewish exiles from Mesopotamia to Judea. At its height after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, Aramaic, having gradually replaced other earlier Semitic languages, was spoken in several variants all over today's Middle East. As a result, local vernaculars became increasingly prominent, fanning the development of a dialect continuum and differing writing standards. Aramaic's long history, extensive literature, and diverse and widespread use by different religious communities are all factors which have led to the development of so many divergent varieties. Therefore, some Aramaic dialects are mutually intelligible, whereas others are not. As it stands, there is not one singular static Aramaic language. Each time and place has had its own variation. From early Christian times on, distinctions between the dialects used in Mesopotamia and the Levant became fully established. Most dialects can thus be described as either Eastern or Western, and the dividing line being roughly the Euphrates River, okay, around here. Now, some variants of Aramaic are also retained as sacred languages by certain religious communities. Most notable among them is Syriac, which is the Eastern Aramaic literary variety used as a liturgical language by Christian communities of ethnic Assyrians and Maronites throughout the Middle East and diaspora, as well as the St. Thomas Christians in India. Significantly, the exiled Judeans picked up Aramaic during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. Aramaic was thus the language of Jesus, who spoke the Galilean dialect of Western Aramaic during his public ministry, as well as that of several sections of the Hebrew Bible, and also the language of the Targum, which is its Aramaic translation. Another of these sacred Aramaic dialects is Mandaic from southern Mesopotamia, which besides also having a vernacular called Neo-Mandaic, has remained the liturgical language of the Sabaean Mandaean religion in Iraq and Iran. At the end of the 2nd century BC, several variants of Aramaic emerged bearing regional characteristics. In the East, dialects like Palmyrene and Arsacid, or Parthian Aramaic, gradually merged with regional vernacular dialects, creating languages that were used between the 1st century BC and 3rd century AD. In the kingdom of Osroene, centered in Edessa, the regional dialect, later known as Classical Syriac, became the official language. And here you can see the oldest inscription in Syriac, which is from about 6 AD. Now, on the upper reaches of the Tigris, North Mesopotamian Aramaic flourished in the regions of Hatra, Assur, and Adiabin. So here you see, for example, Edessa, okay, the capital of Osroene, which is very close to Haran, which is known from the account of the patriarch Abraham in the Old Testament in Genesis, Hatra, Assur, Nineveh, and Erbil, which was the capital of Adiabin. Now, Syriac later became the language of Assyrian Christianity. Here you see an inscription from Assur. I can skip that. So it became the language of Assyrian Christianity. Its golden age between the 4th and 8th centuries began with the translation of the Bible into Syriac. Some say it was originally a Targum for the Syriac-speaking Jewish community, and the masterful prose and poetry of St. Ephraim. The literature written in Syriac is by far the largest and most varied in any Aramaic dialect. And Syriac translations of Greek medical works, literature, and scholarship often served as intermediaries in the Arabic translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries. Thus, Syriac served as an important contributor to the mainstream of medieval Islamic and Western European civilization. Missionary activity also led to the spread of Syriac from Mesopotamia through Persia and into Central Asia, India, and China. And you can see a text from a monument in China with Syriac and Chinese inscriptions. Now, in Babylonia, the regional dialect was used by the Jewish community from about 70 AD and increasingly came under the influence of biblical and Babylonian Targumic Aramaic to form Jewish Babylonian, which was used between the 4th and the 11th centuries. This is the language of the Babylonian Talmud, completed in the 7th century, and of Gaonic literature, which are the most important cultural products of Babylonian Judaism. Babylonian documentary Aramaic began to be used in private documents from the 3rd century onward, and since the 12th century, all Jewish private documents, such as Ketubot, are in this particular dialect. As for Western Aramaic, the form used by the Jewish community in particular is usually referred to as Jewish Palestinian, its oldest form being East Jordanian, the dialect of the oldest manuscript of the Book of Enoch from about 170 BC. The next phase is called Old Judean, which lasted into the 2nd century AD, and in which Flavius Josephus wrote his first non-extant edition of the Jewish War. The main form of this was Hasmonean Aramaic, which was the official administrative language of Hasmonean Judea, alongside Hebrew, which was preferred as a religious language. It influenced the biblical Aramaic of the Dead Sea Scrolls and was the language of the Qumran community's theological texts. Now, the major Targums were originally composed in Hasmonean Aramaic, and these later reached Babylon and Galilee sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century and were then reworked to the contemporary local dialects to create the language of the standard Babylonian and Galilean Targumim, including the official ones, those of Onkelos and Jonathan. Significantly, Babylonian Targumic Aramaic was to form the basis of Babylonian Jewish literature for centuries to follow. So Aramaic and not Hebrew. In addition to the formal literary dialects of Western Aramaic, there were a number of colloquial dialects, 7 varieties of which are known to have been spoken in late antiquity, from Jerusalem and En-Gedi in Judea to Samaria, Galilee, the east of the Jordan River, around Damascus and the anti-Lebanon mountains, and as far north as Aleppo. It is generally believed that in the 1st century, Jews in Judea primarily spoke Aramaic, with a decreasing number using Hebrew as their native language, though many learned it liturgically. Hebrew and Aramaic thus influenced one another through a multitude of loan words and semantic loans. After the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, many Jewish leaders expelled from Jerusalem moved to Galilee. The Galilean dialect thus rose to become the standard among Jews in the West, and for the Jerusalem Talmud completed in the 5th century, as well as the Palestinian Targumim and Midrashim. Significantly, the standard vowel pointing for the Hebrew Bible, the 7th century Tiberian system, was developed by speakers of Galilean Aramaic. So classical Hebrew vocalization, therefore, probably reflects the contemporary pronunciation of that particular Aramaic dialect. Now, the East Jordanian dialect continued to be used into the 2nd century by pagan communities, and then the Christian Palestinian dialect, which is written in Syriac script, used by Christian Melkite communities, may have arisen from that and is attested between the 5th and 8th centuries, continuing as a liturgical language up until the 13th century. Other dialects of Western Aramaic, which are almost identical, continued through Jewish Palestinian in the Assyrian square script and Samaritan Aramaic in the Old Hebrew script, which are now preserved only in liturgical and literary usage. Today, the more widely spoken Eastern Aramaic forms are largely restricted to Christian Assyrian communities in Iraq, northeastern Syria, northwestern Iran, and southeastern Turkey, places which also formerly possessed flourishing Jewish communities, now in Israel, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Western countries such as the United States. On the other hand, so here you can see an English map with some of the Aramaic-speaking Jews from that area. On the other hand, the severely endangered Western Neo-Aramaic is spoken by small communities in Western Syria. Having largely lived in remote areas as insulated communities for over a millennium, the remaining speakers of these dialects have retained use of the once dominant lingua franca, despite linguistic pressures experienced during the subsequent large-scale language shifts throughout the Middle East, most notable of which was the Arabization that began with the 7th century Muslim conquests. However, Aramaic is now considered endangered since several dialects are used mainly by the older generations and therefore could become extinct in the near future. Now, to come specifically to the Jews of Assyria, of the historic region of Assyria. Now, Professor Khezi mentioned that, yes, they trace their origins to Israelite exiles, but that's not the only source population that they trace their origins to. So let's have a look. So the Jews of Assyria trace their origins to one of two, or maybe both of two, main source populations. Now, the first of these are the so-called lost tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel, which were exiled to Assyria between 740 and 722 BC, at a time when Aramaic was the lingua franca. The prophet Nahum who lived around the time of the Assyrian Empire's collapse in 612 BC, was from the Assyrian town of Al-Kosh, where his tomb is still to be found. So that's the first group. Now, the second of these populations are ethnic Assyrian converts to Judaism. And I know probably a lot of Jews don't like to talk about having been descended from converts. That used to be Goyim, but I will just leave that for now. Now, the first of these converts appear to have been pre-Mishnaic rabbinic sages Shemaya and Optalion, who lived in the 1st century BC and were the teachers of the great sage Hillel. They are both described as being descendants of Assyrian king Sennacherib, and they converted to Judaism, and their native language would have thus been Aramaic. They were leaders of the Pharisees, presiding over the great Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, and among the most influential and beloved Jewish religious figures of their time. They are thus termed Gedolei Hador, great men of the age, and are the first to be titled Darshanim, or exegetes, because of the new method of Darush, or biblical interpretation, which they introduced. They are also the first scholars whose sayings are recorded in the Agadah, and the first whose halachot, or legal decisions, were handed down to later times. Their tombs are located in Jish, or Gush Halav, which is a Maronite Christian village in Galilee, northern Israel, and a center of the Arameanist movement in Israel. So further conversion of Assyrians to Judaism occurred under the late antique Parthian vassal kingdom of Adiabene, which had its capital at Erbil, and was inhabited and ruled by Aramaic-speaking Assyrians. The royal family of this kingdom converted to Judaism between 26 and 36 AD, along with many of their relatives, nobles, and even citizens. Queen Helena of Adiabene is known to have used money from the royal treasury to distribute quantities of grain and dried figs to those affected by a terrible famine ravishing Judea in 46 AD. She is also known to have lived as a Nazirite for maybe 14 years and made generous donations to the temple in Jerusalem, the only woman mentioned in the Talmud as ever having done so. Also in Jerusalem, she and her relatives maintained palaces and were eventually buried there. Here you can see the tomb of Queen Helena. Her sarcophagus, now kept in the Louvre, bears an inscription of her name in both Syriac and Aramaic square script, demonstrating her native Aramaic language, Assyrian ethnicity, and Jewish religion. Now her son, Isates II, sent 5 of his sons to Jerusalem to get a thorough knowledge of Hebrew, Jewish culture, and scholarship, and where they could live as Jews and become Torah scholars. Now remember, these were converts to Judaism. They were not Israelites. Her other son, Monobaz II, aided Jewish rebels during the First Jewish-Roman War, and many Assyrians from Adiabene are known to have valiantly fought against the Romans and died as Jews at this time. Adiabene remained an independent Jewish kingdom until 116, when it was conquered by the Emperor Trajan and incorporated as the Roman province of Assyria. Nevertheless, many Assyrians remained Jewish or continued to convert to Judaism even after the arrival of Christianity. For instance, we know of 2 Assyrian Amoraim, or expounders and clarifiers of Jewish law, Jacob and Zuga of Adiabene, who studied under Talmudist Rav Chisda at his academy in Babylonia at the turn of the 4th century. At the same time, in the Talmud, we read that Rav Nahman Bar Yaakov allowed the conversion to Judaism of people from Kardu, which was a northwestern province of Adiabene to the north of present-day Zaho, where a lot of Aramaic-speaking Jews come from. So subsequent to the introduction of Christianity among the Assyrians, many of them converted to it from Judaism, while others held fast to their religion. This is why both Jews and Christians from the historical region of Assyria speak dialects of Neo-Aramaic as their native tongue. And this is also since both Aramaic and Syriac are regarded as sacred languages in their respective religions. Now, their language is termed Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, or Nina, by scholars, who actually marginalize the geographical reality of Assyria, despite the fact that the northern part of the Eastern Aramaic-speaking region is actually historic Assyria. And that is where the language's roots and its Akkadian substrata are derived from. Obviously, those who converted to Islam, on the other hand, also abandoned Aramaic as they assimilated into Arabs and Kurds, whose native languages were associated with that religion. However, because the majority of ethnic Assyrians converted to Christianity, their identity as Suraye, from Asuraye, i.e. Assyrians, and the name of the language, Surit, from Asurit, i.e. the Assyrian language, became closely associated with the religion of Christianity to the point of them becoming synonymous with each other. And here you can see a dictionary entry from 1900 where the word Suraya is described as meaning Syriac, Aramaic, Christian, and having its origins in the word Asuraya, Assyrian. Okay. And this is why the vast majority of Assyrian Jews did not identify with the terms Suraya and Surit, instead preferring to call themselves by the name of their religion and their language, either as the language of the Jews, the language of the Targum, or simply our own language. This, along with the lack of Assyrian national awareness, is also what made it easier for them to identify as Kurds, Kurdish Jews, or Jews of Kurdistan. Unfortunately, despite them not speaking any Kurdish as their native language, or being ethnically Kurdish, as well as them being much older than the Kurdish presence in the areas they historically inhabited and were indigenous to. And the fact that Kurds, as Professor Khezi mentioned, actually bought and sold them like cattle and traded them as slaves. Following on from that, I wonder why it's so acceptable for the Jews who resided among Iraqi Arabs to be named Babylonian Jewry, while Babylonia hasn't existed as a state since 539 BC. But people don't find it just as logical to call a spade for Assyrian Jewry and prefer to call them Kurds, and that is a crying shame. Now, in conclusion, Aramaic has been an Assyrian language since the 8th century BC and is a cornerstone of the modern Assyrian identity. Moreover, had the Assyrians not adopted Aramaic as an official language, it would have never become a lingua franca, attained its historical prestige, or spread to such a large geographical area. Similarly, the Aramaic-speaking Jews of historic Assyria, or the Assyrian Jews, are an integral part of the Assyrian people. They are Assyrians of Jewish religion and Israelis of Assyrian heritage. The only other people in the world who speak the same language as these Jews, as Itzik said before, are the Assyrian Christians, who additionally share with them historical, cultural, and even genetic ties. My grandfather did, for example, a DNA test and turned out to be about 45% Mizrahi Jewish. And we don't know of any Jewish ancestry. Anyhow, this is why we must maintain and strengthen these ties between Christian and Jewish Assyrians in the Assyrian homeland, in Israel and the diaspora, in order for them to be able to preserve their ancient culture and sacred language, so that it may continue to be practiced and spoken by future generations and not forgotten. Moreover, since Aramaic is so important to Jewish heritage, it is imperative that Israel, being the world's only Jewish state, do much more to preserve and transmit it, as well as to support their closest cousins, the Assyrians. Thank you very much. Toda raba. Hawitum basima bas meganofu.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for that breathtaking, wide-ranging talk, which brought everything together.